Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week. What are you bringing to the table today?
I am, and you made me laugh right before this, so I'm getting it together. I have brought a piece from In These Times to the table for us to talk about today. The piece, which actually is a current events type of piece in comparison to some of the other things we've discussed here, which is pretty cool. The piece is called Spurned by the DNC, the Uncommitted Movement Staged Sit-In. It was written by Eman Abdelhadi and was published last month during the Democratic National Convention. I mentioned this last week when I introed the piece, but Eman is an activist, writer, sociologist, and professor over at the University of Chicago. And in this piece, she describes and analyzes the DNC's decision to refuse a vetted speech to be given by a Palestinian on the DNC stage during the convention. And she also talks about what the uncommitted movement is fighting for in the context of this election, in the context of their demands for a ceasefire, and also just, I think, in general. So really been looking forward to talking about this piece with you. I enjoyed this piece. There's a lot to learn here about what the uncommitted movement and the uncommitted delegates are fighting for. And, you know, as I think I said last week, I really wanted to amplify that. So let's get into it. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, this is a great report of what was happening during the DNC, which I'm glad we're talking about it. And it also feels weird because it feels like old news at this point.
Yeah. Every day something happens.
Yeah, there's just been so many things happening. It just feels like old news, even though it's just a couple weeks old. But This is the cycle of a podcast where we decide the things that are happening. It just takes a couple weeks to get to things.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us along with the old news that we're talking about today, folks. But I appreciate part of the article outlines the history of how these folks in the uncommitted movement came to be organized during the primary season and during the DNC itself.
Right.
And one thing that I think is important to continue to highlight is how many Democratic voters want to see a ceasefire in Gaza, according to some polling numbers from Data for Progress that I found, and they published in May.
Okay.
83% of likely Democratic voters want to see a ceasefire in Gaza.
Wow.
So this is a vast majority of people who will likely be voting for Kamala Harris, who want to see the U.S. do more than talk about how they're working tirelessly for a ceasefire.
Yes.
They don't want to hear about how a ceasefire is close to done, but actually doesn't include terms about a permanent ceasefire. More than 40,000 people are confirmed dead in the almost 11 months since Israel started their siege on Gaza, and that is likely a severe undercount.
Yeah.
The Lancet, a medical journal, published an article in July that estimated the death toll could be 186,000. So this is an urgent demand from people who want an end to the slaughter of Gazans, myself included, and it's just ignored, and it's outright ignored, and specifically said we refuse to do that.
Yes.
That's what the Harris campaign has said, is that we refuse to stop sending arms to Israel. We refuse to put any pressure on them to stop the slaughter in Gaza. And that is directly opposed to what a vast majority of their voters want to see. And it's hard to square all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. You said a lot of powerful things there. The one thing that stood out to me was, you talk about how we want more than just talk. And that's exactly it. Especially given how long this genocide has been going on and how many innocent Palestinians have been killed these past 11 months. It's just tragic in every way possible. And I think you're right. It's not just these uncommitted voters, uncommitted delegates who want to see a ceasefire. It's so many Democratic voters too. It's the both of us. It's so many people.
And that's the start, right? That's the
gosh.
first thing we want.
That's a good point.
And then from there, that 83% of people, what we want to see next probably changes.
Yes.
Right?
Oh, absolutely.
But
yeah.
83% of us all agree that this needs, where we're at right now, what's happening right now needs to stop.
What has happened so far has to stop. Absolutely. One of the other things you mentioned was how Eman talks about the history of how uncommitted folks came to be organized during the primary season and during the DNC itself. And I wanted to talk about that because she, as you said, talks about it. She says, quote, Uncommitted was born in Michigan 3 weeks ahead of the state's February Democratic primary. President Joe Biden's polling had been plummeting, largely over his support of Israel's highly unpopular offensive in Gaza. Organizers Layla Elabed and Abbas Alawi founded Listen to Michigan, a campaign that urged voters to voice their dissatisfaction with the Biden administration's support for the violence by voting uncommitted rather than casting votes for the incumbent. In just 3 weeks of organizing and with a relatively tiny budget, they captured more than 100,000 votes, representing a whopping 13% of Michigan's voters in the Democratic primary. And that was huge, right? 13% in a state like Michigan. I mean, that is huge. And it's incredible work that these organizers did. And that movement has spread to quite a few other states. And ultimately, the delegates who were at the DNC, Eman says in this piece, represent more than 800,000 voters across the United States, which is just a mind-blowing number of people. And again, thinking about what it is that we're all committed to, right? A little joke there, is a ceasefire, right? At minimum. And, so I appreciate it, learning a little bit more about the history, where it started, where it's going, and how this movement is representing so many of us.
Yes. And I think there is some ripe comedy for uncommitted being a commitment to things.
Yes.
And our friends over at the Bad Hasbara podcast made some jokes about it this week about uncommitted being an issue in relationships, and those folks finally getting together. And,
that's right. Look at that.
Anyway, the serious part of this is huge. And, Cori Bush is mentioned in this article.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, she just lost her primary, and so has Jamal Bowman. And they were both targeted by AIPAC for their stances about the ceasefire.
Yep.
And I just saw a report a few days ago that AIPAC has already spent more than $100 million this election cycle.
Wow.
And we're not talking about the main election yet. It's all been primaries.
Yep.
And the article says this about Cori Bush, quote, she was Missouri's first black female congressperson. Along with a ceasefire and weapons embargo, Bush had reiterated Uncommitted's demand that a Palestinian American be allowed to take the main stage at some point at the convention. And I think it's so important to point out how these two folks who have been targeted, and more people were targeted as well, but ended up winning their primaries. Summer Lee in Pennsylvania won her primary, and then Ilhan Omar in Minnesota won her primary as well. And they were both also targeted by AIPAC. But these were two progressive black Congress people who have been targeted by this organization that is representing Israel's interests in the United States. And it's just an interesting dynamic that they were the ones who were targeted. And I guess it's because they were the most outspoken.
They were very outspoken.
They also happened to be black and breaking some boundaries in their home states and in their home districts. And that was punished.
Yes.
And so it's just, I wanted to just spend a moment on that because we haven't had a chance to talk about that yet. But there's a lot of money flowing into this election, into people who are going to oppose what the Uncommitted movement is all about. And I think that's just something to name and notice and, oppose in ways that we can oppose it.
The interesting thing about your thoughts there, what it made me think about was this idea and this sort of this idea in our society that, black people should be in their place, should stay in their place, right? And it's the idea in popular culture and sports around, basketball players and football players, just play your sport, just throw your ball, don't say anything. So that just really resonated with me and struck a chord as you were talking about it. It was like, as a black man, I'm often, society tells me I should shut up and stay in my place and not ruffle feathers and
stay in your lane, don't rock the boat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just talk about your constituency. Why are you talking about this, and not recognizing that this is connected to all of these other things.
So there it is. There it is.
And that's, I think, one of the reasons why people get opposed, right? Is if they're able to connect the dots across all of these things that are happening, that becomes some dangerous political education for a vast majority of people in ways that political education doesn't usually reach large audiences. When you're a sitting congressperson, you have that platform, you have that access to people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you brought up Court Bush and Jamal Bowman. I was definitely disappointed about their losses. And it's just wild to think about AIPAC and the amount of money that they have raised and that they continue to raise. And you make a really good point that that's just the primaries. I hadn't really thought about that. Like, we still have to get to the main election. Wow. Yeah. So, well, thanks for that.
Sorry.
I'm like processing it in real time. The other thing I wanted to mention from this piece, which I think is related to what we just talked about a little bit ago. So it's this idea that even though the uncommitted movement has been clear in their demands, it's been a real battle to get the Democratic Party leadership to take stock of or to heed those demands, right? So in this piece, Eman says, quote, getting Democratic Party leadership to respond to this clear majority opinion has been an uphill battle. The main stage DNC programming has been festive, and Democrats have been attempting to project an image of internal unity and pure enthusiasm for Vice President Kamala Harris. Palestine has appeared only on the peripheries of the main stage. Disruptions have been quickly repressed, and in at least one case even met with some violence by other attendees. And the Harris campaign has categorically rejected a weapons embargo. And I think, unfortunately, there's been talk about how Harris and the Democratic leadership hasn't actually done much to a weapons embargo in reality. So you mentioned Representative Ilhan Omar. She's quoted in this piece saying that America is still supplying the weapons. And so if the leadership truly wants a ceasefire, they have to stop sending weapons to Israel. Like, period, full stop. Like, that is step one, clear step one in that work. And so it makes me appreciate the uncommitted movement. They're out here doing the work of keeping those demands at the forefront, which is so important.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people say is that an arms embargo wouldn't do much in terms of stopping what's happening right now, but military leaders in Israel said they can't do what they're doing without the U.S. weapons.
Look at
so
that.
There's a lot of connections here, and I think there's also a lot of political pressure that the U.S. can apply to say, hey, you need to stop what you're doing, and we're choosing not to tell them that because for reasons. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is the small victory that the uncommitted delegates did have. They had a quote, a panel called Democrats for Palestinian Human Rights, which they noted was the first such official DNC panel in the party's history. It featured uncommitted co-founder Layla El-Abed, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, former Representative Andy Levine, Democrat from Michigan, who was also targeted by AIPAC, and several Palestinian American doctors who have visited Gaza on emergency missions over the past few months. And so as one tactic, I think this is an important thing to do to get more stories from more people into places like the DNC.
Absolutely.
We need to bear witness to these stories because, as I said in our episode about Their Borders, Our World a couple weeks ago, Mahdi Sabah says that, quote, in actively witnessing what oppressive systems do to communities and their environments, we begin to build a tradition of witness, one that makes solidarity not only possible, but inevitable. So we need more people who are in the seats of power to bear witness to what is happening to people in Gaza and the West Bank, not just in the context of the current siege, but across the consistent necro-political policies that the Israeli government enforces. And I think doing this in places like the DNC takes those stories to seats of power that exist and changes the stories that people hear to broaden them, to understand more about what is happening to people, because a lot of that gets hidden away in our media coverage, our sort of culture around media. Those stories don't get told in the same way that other stories get told.
Absolutely. Well, in addition to your great point about it's important to do this at the DNC and to have the DNC leadership and the Democratic leadership see it, it also puts it on the national and international stage. Everyone, the world is watching these conventions. And so to have the uncommitted host this panel at this event is huge on so many levels. So yeah, I appreciate them. I appreciate Eman naming that as a victory in this work. I feel like you started to shift us over to some application here, because that's a tactic. I love your connection to the book we read. That also made me think of the articles we read around protest and time and space and where you do things. So you're getting us to application. So let's move on over to application and talk about that now. So how does this piece and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and our work? I think one of the biggest takeaways from this piece, and it's, again, one of the reasons why I was excited to bring this piece to the table today, I think a big takeaway is that the uncommitted movement is strong and is committed to this work. And so here's an excerpt from this piece to that point. Quote, "You can try to suppress us. We're not going anywhere," said Alawi, before declaring he was going to sit down and stay in place. He was joined by several other uncommitted delegates who also sat down and linked arms. "We're not going anywhere in 4 years. We're not going anywhere in 8 years." And so I think regardless of what happens in November, both parties are going to have to contend with this movement and these organizers and their demands. And I think that, like with so many of our most powerful movements, this work takes time, but I'm truly excited to see what the uncommitted movement's impact will be in the future. And I love that they've been unequivocal in their stance, in their opinions, and that they're not going anywhere. Yeah. What about you?
My application comes from June Rose, who's one of the uncommitted delegates from Rhode Island.
Yes.
June says, quote, "In the wake of a mass shooting, Democratic leaders are quick to say thoughts and prayers are not enough. As Vice President Harris takes a more empathetic tone, we say the same to her. Thoughts and prayers are not enough."
Yes.
They're not enough. We needed to see a permanent ceasefire agreement and an arms embargo, both of which should be a plan for long-term peace and justice for Palestinians.
Yes.
Because otherwise, we're just going to be back here where we've been several times over the last almost 80 years.
Yes, absolutely. I loved that quote, right? Thoughts and prayers. We see it too much with gun violence, and there's a clear application of that here as well. Absolutely. All right, good stuff. Well, let's talk about homework now. What do we want to do to continue our learning once we leave the table today? For one, I certainly think we will continue to follow the uncommitted movement and what they're doing between now and the election and even beyond. I definitely want to figure out how I can continue to support their efforts and how we can amplify their efforts for sure. I also want to look into the uncommitted delegates that are mentioned in this piece. We've mentioned some of them, but just to see what else I can learn about their work, their platforms, and to get a sense of that outside of what they're doing for Israel and Palestine. How about you?
Yeah, so my homework, I've got a couple pieces. One of the things that I just remembered is that the DNC quietly removed their, because we're talking about the DNC, I don't foresee us revisiting the DNC. I just want to mention this real quick.
Yep.
The DNC did a lot of things to remove certain items from their platform.
Yeah.
One of them was opposition to the death penalty. That is no longer part of their party platform.
Yep.
And I think that deserves some attention, and I think they need to add that back in.
Yes, 100%.
So that's just one aspect of something that I know that they quietly removed from their platform.
And I'd love to know why. Right?
Yeah,
You're right, because it was quietly done. Yeah.
And I think there's a few more things like that they are not pursuing, and I wonder what the political capital that they have, because they know who their opposition is and they know how, I think, scared so many people are of what that opposition will do once they take power, because they've laid out a gigantic plan called Project 2025 of what they plan to do if they take power. And a lot of that stuff is terrifying.
Yes.
And, if you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, like, what can you now get away with?
Yes.
What are they able to get away with, because they know that so many of us are so opposed to that?
Yeah.
And so they're able to get away with stuff like, well, we don't care about the death penalty anymore. That's fine.
Yeah.
And
but it's such a slap in the face, right? That we're not intelligent enough and capable to hold all of the things that are important to us.
Yeah. And I think that's just something to pay attention to. Like, what have they removed? How are they moving to the right? Because they know that their opponents are so far to the right that they still look like they're not on the right.
Absolutely.
But they really are. So that's one piece of my homework. The other piece is I want to spend a little bit more time with the proposed speech for the DNC that Georgia State Representative Ruah Rahman wanted to deliver on the main stage there. I wanted to share how she closes that speech because I think it sets the context for justice for Palestinians alongside the other policies that the Democratic Party claims to be in favor of. So Ruah Rahman says, "Let's commit to each other, to electing Vice President Harris and defeating Donald Trump, who uses my identity as a Palestinian as a slur. Let's fight for the policies long overdue, from restoring access to abortions to ensuring a living wage to demanding an end to reckless war and a ceasefire in Gaza. To those who doubt us, to the cynics and the naysayers, I say, yes, we can. Yes, we can be a Democratic Party that prioritizes funding our schools and hospitals, not for endless wars. That fights for an America that belongs to all of us, black, brown, and white, Jews and Palestinians, all of us, like my grandfather taught me, together." And I think that's a powerful way to challenge and push the DNC and what it is that they claim to be for, and bringing more people into that tent, so to speak, to speak that sort of political party vernacular. I think it expands the tent. It expands the concept of what it is that they should be working towards, and also crystallizes the things that they have claimed to be in favor of for many years now.
I love that. I love that. Absolutely. It's a great speech. Unfortunately, we weren't able to hear it at this platform. So,
and if you want to read it, folks,
yes.
you can find it just by searching. I found it on Mother Jones's website, but it's also been published by several people online. Like I think Ibram X. Kendi published it on his social media platforms, and a bunch of other people did too. So it's floating around. You can find it.
Absolutely. Very good. All right. Well, that was great. Thanks for engaging in that conversation with me, and thanks for listening, everybody. And with that, my friend, you're up next time.
I am.
What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing an article from Scalawag magazine called "Louisiana is the Blueprint for Further Fascist Repression." It's written by Gabrielle Perry, and it's part of a series over at Scalawag called "As the South Votes," which that series focuses on, quote, an election year that marks the culmination of nearly 4 years of rapidly expanding repressive fascist state apparatus.
Wow.
This election season, our region continues to be the nation's testing ground for censorship, policing, and access barriers that define post-2020 reality. So Perry starts their article with this, quote, "Louisiana is on a concerning spiral toward a repressive regime that intends to harm and violate its citizens. On a more alarming scale, with the rise of many of Louisiana's far-right politicians into positions of federal power, the rights and freedoms of every American are now at risk as well." So a really great critical look into what's happening in Louisiana and how they could spread that across the country. And I actually finished reading it earlier today, and it tackles a lot. It shows a lot of how these ideas that they are very radical, right-wing, repressive, authoritarian ideas are being implemented in Louisiana, and how they could spread to other states as well across the country.
Right.
And so they talk about Mike Johnson, who's from Louisiana, is now the House Speaker. Amy Coney Barrett is from Louisiana and is now on the Supreme Court. So there's lots of ways that these far-right people are finding seats of power and implementing these kind of fascist repressive policies on people across the country.
Wow. Well, yeah, this sounds like a fascinating piece. And I hadn't really thought about Louisiana being this hotbed, right, of fascism and the power that Louisiana has produced out in the world. And I also hadn't heard of Scalawag. So I'm excited to learn a new publication and to learn more about this, because again, this is reality. Yeah, this is real world stuff.
And I imagine we'll talk about this next week, but Steve Scalise is one of the House Republican leaders as well. He is from Louisiana, and he has been criticized by people for years of having spoken at events organized by David Duke, former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. So there's lots of ways that this is all tied up together and is all moving in a way that is interconnected, and they're trying to control us even more across the country, not just in Louisiana.
Interconnected and concerning as hell. Absolutely. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to that conversation for sure. All right, folks. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with everyone you know. Follow us on the socials, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out over on YouTube, and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.